Good morning. It is always a privilege to be in God's house and to be able to lift our hands and our voices and to worship God for who He is. Just before I said announcements for the week, I just want to encourage God's children here this morning to remain steadfast in God. For the past couple of weeks and days, we have seen, we have heard much. We are touched with what we see, what we hear from our neighboring islands, and even in the USA. But even though we are seeing and hearing and experiencing and having all the different emotions that goes along with tragedy, death, as God's children, we must remain steadfast in Him. Because if we don't remain steadfast in Him, what will become of us? So these few encouraging words that I'm going to encourage you, as I also always encourage myself. Steadfastness in God, even during our times of difficulties, is a true expression of our faith in God. It is a life of pleasing unto our God. Hebrews 11:6 tells us, but without faith, it is impossible to please God. For he that cometh to God must believe that He is, and that He is a rewarder of them that diligently seek Him. A life of steadfastness unto God is a life of surrender, a life of obedience unto God. It's a life whose mind is stayed on God. It is a life of dependency upon God. It is a life of trusting God. It is a life that acknowledges God for who He is. Let's look at the life of surrender and the life of obedience unto God. A life of surrender means that our lives are wholly given over to God. It is absolute humility and obedience. It is a life that has come to the understanding that nothing we give up for the sake of knowing Christ is ever really a loss, when it's Christ that you and I gain. Galatians 2:20 tells us, I am crucified with Christ. Nevertheless, I live, yet not I, but Christ liveth in me. And the life which I now live in this flesh, I live by the faith of the Son of God, who loved me and gave Himself for me. A life that is surrendered to God is a life that is lived absolutely in contrast to the ways of the world. It is a life we call to live as followers of Christ. Romans 12:2. And be not conformed to this world, the Bible tells us, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind, that ye may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. A life of steadfastness is a life whose mind is stayed on God. Isaiah 26 verse 3 tells us, thou wilt keep him in perfect peace, whose mind is stayed on thee, because he trusted in thee. That life knows its mind belongs to God, and it is to be devoted entirely to Him. It is a mind that seeks with the help of God to bring every thought into captivity to the obedience of God. 2 Corinthians 10:5. casting down imaginations and every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God, and bringing into captivity every thought to the obedience of Christ. And I know this week and the past weeks, you and I have had many thoughts with what we see, what we hear, with the passing of the weather in the Bahamas. But as God's children, I'm encouraging you this morning, remain steadfast in God and know that God is still a good God, and He is still faithful, and He will be faithful to the end. A life of steadfastness is a life of dependency upon God. We depend on God because we know that we can trust Him. Trusting Him means having faith in Him. The stronger our faith in God grows, the more dependent we become on Him. Psalms 27, verse 13 and 14. I had fainted unless I had believed to see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. And 14 tells us, wait on the Lord. And I put between brackets, be steadfast, be of good courage, and He shall strengthen thy heart. Wait, I say, on the Lord. Trusting the Lord is a lifelong challenge. We never finally arrived until we see Jesus face to face. Each new crisis calls for recommitment. The good news is that the more we see God's loving hand working in our lives, the more we learn to let go and trust Him. A songwriter said, through it all, I have learned to trust in Jesus. I have learned to trust in God. When we trust the Lord, the weight of the world, the cares of this life is lifted off our shoulders. The pressure is off now. It is God. He can handle it. He is capable. He can handle it perfectly. A life that is steadfast, depending on God, is also a life that is humble. James 4:10 tells you and I, humble yourself in the sight of the Lord, and He shall lift you up. And last but not least, a life of steadfastness is a life that acknowledges God for who He is. Proverbs 3, verse 6, in all thy ways acknowledge Him, and He shall direct thy paths. Acknowledging the Lord in all our ways means keeping Him in mind in every area of our lives. Acknowledging Him is saying, Lord, this is what I'm facing, and I need you to handle this for me. He wants us to remember Him all the time, to trust Him, to guide us and teach us throughout our lives. True steadfastness in God is without wavering. True steadfastness in God is knowing and believing that with God all things are possible. James 1:8 tells us that a double-minded man is unstable in all his ways. So we must believe and we must not waver. Living a life of steadfastness in God means that your faith is rooted and grounded in God, and that you know that your life is in God's hand no matter what. So that was my encouraging words to you all this morning, to remain steadfast in God.